intro, and then we can just get started with all that. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today's guest is Liran Kandin. He is a passionate and driven lawyer and instructor. He wants to make our Canadian bar as diverse and welcoming as it can be. Over the past few years, he has assisted those lawyers from overseas fulfill their aspirations by preparing them for recertification for the Canadian bar. I think the number has gone up there, but over 2,000 lawyers from over 60 countries. So thank you, Liran, for joining us. And perhaps maybe you can expand on that and tell us a bit about all your work there and your work in practice as well.
Sure. Thank you, Al, first of all, for inviting me. Really appreciate the invitation. And John Paul, thank you very much for hosting me. Just a little bit about my background, perhaps. Maybe I'll start there. I started with an undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto in business, and I spent 5 years in business school. That's my background. I worked in the tech industry for a couple of years in sales at IBM and Salesforce. I was always driven towards technology and stuff like that. But something in me, really enjoyed the art of debating and thinking. And that made me passionate about law. And I went and further in my career, I left business and I went to law school and I did a law degree. Eventually, I moved to New York City, where I practiced international trade and corporate law. And I left private practice to go to the University of Toronto for a Master's of Law degree in business law as well. And I ended up specializing in constitutional law and business law issues. And I wrote a thesis on kind of a mix of both of them, really. And since then, or even before then, for the last 9 years, I set up a company called Lex Professional Development, and we do professional development courses for lawyers, as well as for internationally trained lawyers that are looking to recertify and requalify. And so that's what I've been keeping busy with for the past 9 years now. Yeah, that's my background.
Now let's start with the NCA process there. I do get a few students, and perhaps you've dealt with them as well, that they come here and while they're going through the NCA process, they're like, hey, I want to get some Canadian education, and then they join the paralegal program, and subsequently then they may become licensed as a lawyer as well, or maybe they just give up on that. But I do have a few who ask me that question. Well, hey, how do I become licensed here in Canada? So maybe you can walk through that process and how it works for someone who is a foreign trained lawyer that wants to be a lawyer here in Canada.
Sure, absolutely. That is definitely one of the paths that lawyers take because, if I'm not mistaken, the diploma is about a year long to do a paralegal diploma. And so some, foreign trained lawyers start with a paralegal program and they'll work a little bit. And then they might consider going through the licensing process. So you'd submit your application to a body called the National Committee on Accreditation. The National Committee is a standing committee of the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. And the Federation of Law Societies has several mandates from the individual law societies that delegate certain powers over education and requalification. So they set the standards for legal education in Canada, as well as the reassessment of foreign applicants. So it's standardized and it's uniform throughout. So that's for all 9 provinces. It does not include Quebec. So if you're thinking of practicing civil law, you have to go through Barreau du Québec, and it's a different system. But if you're looking to recertify in any other province, including Ontario, that's the process. You submit to the NCA. And if you've done a degree, which is at least, it doesn't have to be a 3-year degree, it could be less, but typically your assessment or the minimum assessment is 5 exams. If you are missing sort of the core qualifications. For example, you have a civil degree and you don't have common law education, they may assign you additional additional assignments, they call it. So you may be required to go to law school, for example. If you don't have any common law background, you have to fulfill at least 1 year of in-class instruction. There may be other reasons why you cannot just write the NCA exams to recertify. For example, you did your law degree online entirely, and so that will not allow you to simply complete NCA exams. But one of the options is to complete out NCA exams, or you can go through a Canadian law school and complete courses to go through the recertification process. But the minimum is 5. I've seen some students have 12 exams to write. I've seen some students have to go to law school to complete the process. But the exams are not particularly challenging because they're testing you on minimum competencies, and the passing score, if you are writing these exams, is 50%. Whereas if you go to law school to complete the courses, the passing mark may be higher. It may be, you need 55 or 60 to pass, and the NCA requires you to achieve at least 5% above the passing grade. So it might actually be more challenging in the law school. But it's not a real barrier to entry, the NCA exams. They're not very difficult. So because they do test those minimum competencies. Once you've completed the assigned, the assignments that they give you in your assessment, whether it's in class, law school, or whether it's these self-study examinations, then you receive what they call a certificate of qualification. And that now allows you to apply to the bar in whichever province you're looking to get licensed. In Ontario, that means you need to article and you need to complete the barrister and the solicitor examinations. The articling period has been tweaked a little bit now during COVID, but it might go back to the 10-month period, the normal articling period that you have to complete. Yeah, so that's that in a nutshell.
All right, so one of the things there is the exams themselves, or certainly that you have a lot of experience helping students prepare for. And I have a critical thinking class right now, and I think maybe this is a perfect thing to kind of segue into both of them. How can students better prepare, I guess, generally for the NCA exams and answer those, or maybe you could explain the format of the exams and how a student can better prepare for them.
Okay, great. And I'll try and connect it to the critical thinking. So the exams are open book exams, which means you get to bring in your materials with you, whether it's statute books, textbooks, your notes. You can bring in whatever materials you like with you, which means that a substantial amount of the grades are not allocated to your knowledge of the law. Because if you're allowed to bring in your materials with you, then surely anyone can copy and paste the law into an exam. What the NCA is testing, and I guess this is connected to critical thinking, is your ability to use the law and apply it to a specific set of facts, right? And to give a well-reasoned, cogent response on how the law is going to apply in this particular scenario. So it's going beyond just cutting and pasting law and rehashing facts of the case. You actually have to analyze those facts and you have to explain what is going to be the outcome in this particular set of facts and why. And I think that kind of connects to this idea of critical thinking. And it's challenging because students come from different jurisdictions where, maybe in their law schools, in their home countries, they may not have learned critical thinking or analytical reasoning because perhaps, law is an undergraduate degree in those countries, or because the examinations are tested differently, they're closed book exams. where you have to memorize large amounts of information, and you're spending a great deal of time explaining the law and how the law has arrived at the current stage it's in. And so it's challenging because you're not always taught critical thinking. Even in Canadian law school, in my experience in the master's level, it wasn't really a focus of our learning. And I'm not sure if you can comment on that, whether there was any focus during your JD or not.
I think at Osgood, I certainly remember a lot of it being more theoretical, right? You would learn cases, do case briefs, and I think I've had quite a few of my former classmates come on. We lament that a lot of the practical stuff you don't learn about how to deal with trust accounting and deal with actual situations. It's always these hypotheticals that are so far fetched that that it's more about the theory there, but maybe that's something that you could talk about with respect to certainly in our paralegal program here, we have a lot of assignments and activities where there's a lot more practical answers to questions, is how to prepare, using critical thinking to prepare for a legal career where you're going to face client situations and you're going to be able to answer those questions using the theory you've learned, but you got to put it into practice. And I think both on the NCA exams and in paralegal studies here and in law school, I think that's the element that some people struggle with, is putting it all together and using those critical thinking and problem solving skills.
Well, I think perhaps one thing we should do is try and define what critical thinking means. I think there might be different ideas and different views of what critical thinking is, but I like to think of it as objective, perhaps in a sense, objective reasoning, where you're not relying on assumptions. You have these legal rules or principles, and then you're trying to analyze and come to some sort of unbiased conclusion, based on applying those rules to a given specific set of facts. And if we define it that way, I think critical thinking in that sense is your ability to go over your own reasoning process and see if your reasoning is flawed in any way because it's based on some sort of assumptions that you're taking for granted. So maybe assumptions of fairness or assumptions of other things that might bias your own reasoning. And perhaps I can speak about this course that I took in university, which sort of surprised me. I took a course with an Ontario Court of Appeal justice named Robert Sharp, who's a current presiding justice. And the course was called Good Judgment. And in that course, we spoke about what a good judgment is and what it means to write a good judgment. And this was incredibly interesting to me because I always wanted to know what the process was of a judge who's sitting and then has to write this reasoned decision. And I don't believe this is the process for every judge. So I think a lot of legal theory goes into this, and it depends on what theory the judge personally subscribed to, whether it's legal positivism or natural law. And I think that highly affects how judges arrive at their conclusions and decisions. But the judge said something like this: after I sit on a case, I think about the facts of the case, and I think about the parties, and I try to understand each party's side, and then I think, what would be a fair outcome here given the circumstances? And then I go and write my judgment. And I was floored. I was so surprised. I was shocked because I thought that was the opposite of the process that you have to use. I thought you have to, start with certain legal principles and standards and then kind of analyze your way and reason to some sort of conclusion. But it seems to be the case that some judges might, take a bow and arrow, shoot it at a tree, and then paint the target around it and say, look, I got the bullseye, right? And so maybe critical thinking in that way is different than how I might view critical thinking, as should be objective and should be based on some starting principles, and then how do we reason to a conclusion. So I think our definition of critical thinking may change that as well. But yes, in some cases, critical thinking means reasoning backwards and trying to get to a decision you think is fair overall. And that's interesting. But the way I view it is perhaps, I think critical thinking means something more objective to me rather than intuitive, and what you think the decision should be. I don't know.
All right, so now we got that definition. How can students better prepare for whether it's the NCA exam or just any sort of fact pattern based examination or assignment to apply that definition now to practice? What are the things that you've seen in your work where people get tripped up on, and what can they do to improve their results on those kinds of tests and assessments?
Great, great question. And I think the answer is reading, and reading case law, but not reading summaries. So I find that a lot of students I work with skip over actual decisions and they don't bother to read it. A lot of times students come to me saying, can we see a sample answer, for example, because I want to see how to critically reason. And I say, well, there's no better sample answer than a Supreme Court decision. A Supreme Court decision will set out, typically what we call the IRAC method, which is, what are the issues we're dealing with in this case? These are the issues, right? What are the rules that apply? And sometimes the Supreme Court will go on a long tangent explaining the rules because they might have to redevelop those rules or whatever it is. But typically you set out what the legal tests are. And then they go through this application section where they talk about the facts of the case and how that meets each of the components of the legal test, or it does not meet them, or it falls short of them. And that's the analysis section, and that is where the critical thinking happens, right? That is where you say, okay, in this given set of facts, it is the same as this previous case, or it's not the same, or we can distinguish it in this case. And so I think that learning the skills to analyze and critically think and distinguish cases comes from practice and practice in reading those types of decisions. And that's the best advice I can give, is to actually go through actual decisions and focus on the application section, so that you can learn through what the Supreme Court has set out. I think that's the best advice I can give.
So there's no shortcuts. Gotta do the readings. Gotta understand that, and then be able to apply it to the situations that you're gonna face with on those exams or on an assignment. What struggles, I guess, now let's say that you do the readings and you see what the Supreme Court judges and justices are writing, and you try to replicate that. What is the difficulty then in looking at a particular scenario and understanding or connecting it to the cases or the readings that you've done, and now drawing more upon it? Where have you found that there's a lack of sort of connection between this fact scenario and the theory you've studied before?
Well, I mean, there may be a situation that's not contemplated, right? Perhaps because when laws are developed, whether it's common law or statutory law, it's hard to develop a law that will account for everyone's circumstances, right? And so you might come across a set of facts that may not line up exactly and apply nicely to a particular scenario. But I think that's the way we can distinguish cases and say, in the previous case where this rule was laid out, these were the set of facts. But we can distinguish that. And so we don't have to follow that ruling, or we may be able to have an exception to the ruling because our decision or our particular set of facts is not the same. So, you know, in common law, this is the way we reason. We reason by analogy, and we reason by looking at different decisions, and we can try and make distinctions in those decisions in that way. So the fact pattern may not align exactly, and then you may try and use that to say why something shouldn't apply. Um, I hope I've addressed your question in that way, but yes, sometimes the fact pattern may not lend itself to a very smooth analysis because it doesn't necessarily apply that way. And that's normal because rules have to be developed for the majority, and there are always exceptions to those rules. Right. And so it may not fit perfectly in that scenario. And then you carve out those exceptions and you argue for those exceptions, or right.
Now, I guess this last year has certainly been more challenging. I believe the exams are being done online, and I've heard there's been some issues with that. But how does that change preparation, or from even your experience with CPD delivery, of absorbing the information or writing the exam itself, where you're in an online environment versus an in-person environment?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for our organization personally, we've always had students located across Canada and in other parts of the country. So we were always partly online to begin with. We gave our classes in North York, in Toronto, and so there are students in person, but then there are also students online. For me personally, I think it's become easier because the dynamic, it's very difficult to juggle an online class and an in-person class at the same time. Um, the dynamic is quite different. I need to make sure that students are engaged all the time. And one of the things I do is I make sure my students have their cameras on. This is not my class, so it's okay that all your cameras are off. But for me personally, I have to see individual reactions. I need to know if someone's sleeping in my class. I need to know if they're engaged because that changes my dynamic, right? I can tell if I'm slouched. I can tell if I'm, if I'm not delivering the materials as I should be. Thank you, Adam. Welcome. Right. So I see him smiling back there. It's a real challenge to teach online. I had a discussion yesterday with a professor at U of T, and he's teaching a negotiations course. And it is really interactive. They go into small groups, and you can do small groups, you can do these groups, breakout rooms and stuff, but it's not the same. You're actually negotiating specific fact situations, and you're trying to, come to some sort of agreement, and it's very difficult to do. So it is challenging for you as students, and I'm sorry that you have those challenges, and I'm sorry that you're going through this, but I guess it's still a good time to be in a program and to be learning in a program right now, because the job market is not incredibly hot right now. So why not spend the time learning? It's a good time to learn. But it is challenging, and I totally understand that. And it's difficult to network. It's difficult, to make friends in those times. You really have to go above and beyond to make those networks, and you should, because in the practice of law, whether you're a lawyer or a paralegal, you need your colleagues. You need them. You're going to rely on them. You need mentors, and people in the legal field, in my experience, are very open to mentoring each other. You can call up any lawyer, and they'll generally be okay to have a coffee chat with you, to talk about something, and to give them that experience. So I find that it's challenging to make that personal connection when you're learning online. As for the exams, there are other challenges, of course. So the NCA has gone online, and so has the Ontario bar exams. The NCA has actually said that they are permanently staying online. They are never going back to written exams. And that is amazing, I think, for students, because a lot of students are on the fence on whether they want to move to Canada. And I think it's difficult to move to a new country when you have to spend a couple of years just trying to get relicensed. and you have to quit your job and all this stuff and just focus on life. You don't have to quit your job. A lot of people are working, but at least this gives people the ability to stay in their home country, write the NCA exams, complete the process, and then come to Canada and say, okay, all I have to do is my articles now, or you can get exempt from articling. And for those of you that may already be lawyers in another country, or you may have a law degree in another country and you're now going through the paralegal process and you work as a paralegal, that experience, even as a paralegal, as long as it's law related, could count towards an articling exemption for you in Ontario. Okay, not all the law societies are as flexible, but Ontario is quite flexible. So long as the legal experience you have right now is connected to law and you're working in law and it's post LLB experience or post JD experience, that will count towards your articling exemption with the law society. So sorry, that's an off point, but I think it's important. It may be relevant to some of you who may have law degrees from a different country. So the going online has been incredibly challenging. Technically, I think for the most part, there are new providers that have popped out that I'm not experienced. So yeah, some students have experienced technical difficulties, being booted out of exams, having to wait 6 hours for a proctor to be available to start your exam. But you can write from the comfort of your home. You can write in your pajamas. That's very nice. And for those of you that are considering maybe the lawyer licensing process, if you do have a degree, actually even the paralegal exams are online now, but they have changed those exams. I'm not familiar with the paralegal exams, but they've shortened the Ontario bar exams from 7 hours to 4 hours now. So I think that gives you a significant advantage. They've also shortened the time per question. It used to be 1 minute 45 seconds per question. Now it's only 1.5 minutes. So you have less time, but you needed those extra 15 seconds per question when you're writing a 7-hour exam and you're on the 5th or 6th or 7th hour, your brain is not working as it should be, right? It's an endurance exam. Everyone can pass this exam, everyone, if you have all the time in the world. Right, but can you pass it within 7 hours? You have 1 minute 45 seconds per question. So now they've shortened that exam to just 160 questions, at least for the bar exam, not necessarily for the paralegal exam. But they've also shortened the time. But it's online, and I found that the process is smooth. You can flag questions, and the paralegal exam should be the same way. When you're going through the paralegal exam, you could not do this before, right? So as you're on the screen and you're thinking about a question, you can click the flag that says, I want to flag it. And at the end of the exam, you can just go through and scroll through your flagged questions. That's incredibly useful, saves you a ton of time, right? And you don't have to worry about bubbling, which was very time consuming and stressful, because if you bubbled, prior to being online, there was a Scantron sheet that had, questions 1 through however many questions were on the exam, and you had to bubble your answers, A, B, C, or D. That's a very time-consuming process. And if you miss one bubble, meaning you bubbled the wrong one, all of your answers that flow are wrong. So you're just very careful, making sure you're bubbling correctly. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff now. It's all online, and you just click the right one and you move on. So there are differences and there are advantages to being online. And there are also disadvantages to being online. And I think that once these technical issues get ironed out, I think that personally, I think online exams have much more benefits than they do disadvantages, in my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, and just wanted to clarify, I think I see a question as well about it, but the paralegal exams also cut down to 4 hours from the usual 6 to 7 there. So the same thing, 90 seconds per question. So it's probably about almost identical, but just the different subject matters compared to the lawyers writing the L1 or the barristers and then the solicitors exams for those looking to become lawyers. Now with that, I appreciate certainly that the discussion you had there with someone else that you shared here today about teaching online with the cameras. I find that's the biggest challenge on the other end, is that you don't always see people and you don't know how things are resonating, if people are understanding it, if people are even there. and then I mean, there's ways to check if they're there, but how the material is being absorbed. But let's go back maybe on the other end, on the student end. You are at home, you're in your pajamas, you know, you may have distractions there as well, but how do you kind of tune out that noise and focus in on a lecture or material? I know for me, I've been doing all these webinars from time. It was always the advantage of going to the CPD in person was to get the nice spread of food at the Law Society breakfast or lunch there. But other than that, I mean, you would save the commute and listen online. But I think now we're seeing it everywhere, and it's going to be hard to kind of get back into the in-person learning whenever we go back to that.
Yeah. So I'll just say that I might be wearing pajamas underneath here, but you know, it is, you know, COVID has thrown you all a curveball, and we're all trying to figure it out right now. And you know, one of the ways I do it is my students do ask for pre-recorded, like, or to record the lectures so they can view them afterward. I don't do that. No. That way they're in the moment. This is their only chance, right? They're in the moment and they're there. I make myself available after for questions, and of course I'm there. And we also have an online, you know, discussion group available. We use Google Classroom so that we can have questions and students can answer each other's questions, because it is challenging sometimes when you have large groups of students. I'm not sure how many students you have, but at any given time I could have over 100 students. So I don't always have the ability to answer everybody's individual questions, but the power of the group, I think, is important, right? So one of the ways to stay engaged is treat it like it's a lecture that, you know, even if you do have your recordings afterward, try and be in the moment in it, you know, while you're in your lecture, and just, you know, assume that you can't go back. Maybe that would keep you more engaged. Perhaps, you know, I think it's a good idea to make friends in your class and have review sessions. It's incredibly important to review whatever you're learning in class just within a few days that you learn it. Otherwise, it's really hard to recall, you know, the materials if you're studying for an exam 2 months later and you haven't reviewed the materials directly after. So I like to tell my students that, you know, we have a class, we have materials. I want you to review these materials in the next 2 to 3 days after, you know, after we've covered it. I want you to go through it. And if you have a little study group, I think that's going to be great, because you'll remember those things. You'll remember, you know, the individuals you're studying with, and you'll certainly recall what happened in class if you can review it just a few days later. So treat it like it's the only time it's playing in real time, and try and make friends. This is the most important advice I give my students over and over again, particularly my students who are foreign trained lawyers. They weren't in law school. They don't have their Canadian, you know, law school graduate friends from their class that go on to become lawyers. And you need a network if you're practicing, especially if you're going out on your own as a solo practitioner. You need to call somebody up. And you know, one of the perks of being an instructor is that I now have over 1,000 lawyers that I've worked with, and I've had phone calls with tax lawyers that normally would cost me $800 an hour, and I haven't paid a dime. So students tend to be very grateful for, you know, for you teaching them. So you need a network, and I know it's really hard to do, but try and find a few people in your class that you can work with, and try and switch groups as well. If there's any way you can facilitate that, I think it's incredibly important. The networking is important. Of course, you'll remember the lectures and you'll remember everything you learned, but knowing people out in the industry that are practicing in different areas of practice, you don't know when your paths will cross again. And I don't think of it as a way like, what can my colleagues do for me? I think about, what can I do for my colleagues, right? People get in touch with me, and I'm networking not just because I want something from them. I always think how I can help somebody else. And that's, you know, that's incredibly important in this field because it is a small field.
That's great advice. It comes up a lot from all the people that I've brought in about mentorship and networking because it is a small um, group, especially for my paralegal students. It's even smaller than us lawyers here in Ontario. But one of the things I was wondering, maybe if you've had experience with, because you have a lot of foreign students coming to Canada, what are the biggest challenges with um, whether it's the Canadian legal system or it's the way of instruction or it is the language? What are some of the challenges that they've mentioned to you in preparing for the exams?
So language barriers and oh, there it is. Of course, language could be a difficulty. Let me start by saying there are two groups of NCA candidates. You have Canadian-born, Canadian-raised students who are going abroad for various reasons. Um, and then you also have the newcomers to Canada and new immigrants to Canada. And then, of course, within the new immigrants to Canada, you may have some candidates where English is not their first language. And so, of course, language is a challenge, could be a challenge for some of those students. I think the different learning methods as well, where in Canadian law school, at least my experience with my master's degree, I did do my law degree abroad. I studied at the University of Manchester in the UK. And it's an undergraduate degree, and the focus and the emphasis was not on analytical and critical thinking. We didn't use IRAC, and we were expected to regurgitate a lot of information and have very little analysis. But in North America, I think students are grilled from first year on IRAC and application, and that is similar to the US model, and it's similar to the Australian model as well. But other countries may not have that for various reasons, right? So learning a different methodology of learning, where in some countries it's just memorization and regurgitation on your exams because you're closed book. So that's a big challenge, is getting over what is the expectation here? What do they want me to do? They want to see your analytical reasoning. They want to see your conclusion flow from your reasons. They don't just want to see the legal test and then a conclusion. They need to see the meat, which is the critical thinking and your analysis and application and how you arrived at that conclusion. So knowing the expectations is also a challenge because it's not really taught anywhere. And so you have to understand that there may be different expectations than what you are used to. The Law Society has produced statistics that they've never released before. The Law Society guards their stats about the bar exams, and they don't like to tell anyone what the pass rates are or anything of that sort. But in 2017, I believe it was, or 16, there was a dialogue on the licensing process, and they were considering revising the licensing process. And the Law Society did release statistics for the last, I think it was 3 or 4 years of bar pass rates. The pass rates for Canadian graduates was somewhere around 87% on their first attempt. So 87% of the people passed the bar exams on their first attempt. The NCA candidates, or the foreign trained candidates, pass rates were around 53%. And that's a significant gap or difference. I don't want to make any assumptions as to why there's this gap, but I would bet that language barrier is going to be one of the reasons, because the exam you're being tested on, whether it's the paralegal or the Ontario bar exam, is a race against the clock. And that exam depends on whether you can read very quickly and comprehend the questions. Okay, so reading comprehension makes a big difference. And if English is not your first language, reading under timed conditions can be challenging. It can be challenging. So I think that could explain a significant portion of the gap between NCA students and the Canadian trained students as well. So language, certainly, the expectations that the examiners have in a different jurisdiction, and just adapting to a different system. I think those are some of the challenges that students face. Yeah.
Now, I see a question here from one of the students about critical thinking. Does that also encompass strategic thinking and creative thinking, or would you sort of separate those out in your ability to critically think and solve a problem there?
Good. So, again, I think it depends on maybe what you view as strategic and creative thinking. But so I'm just going to guess what creative thinking means and what strategic thinking is. In practice, your clients are going to come to you with some sort of problem. Okay, they have a problem, and the law may not be favorable in that instance, right, for that problem. And it's your responsibility to try and find a way that it could work, right? And that involves more than just critical thinking and reasoning. You need to have creative thinking. You need to think outside of the box, and don't be so focused on what the rules are for this particular issue. You need to broaden your horizon because you may find the answer in a different area of law. So, if it comes to corporate law, for example, I dealt with this in practice where a company, it was a publicly traded company. It needed to set up a company internationally in another state, and there are rules about companies operating in that space. They weren't allowed to operate as particular entities. So, we had to put our heads together and say, okay, these are the regulations, these are the rules that are had. How do we get around that? So, I don't think it's critical thinking here and application of the laws, but rather both strategic and creative thinking, saying, look, who says we have to have a company like this? Why not set up a nonprofit organization, which we can somehow manage, and so we restructure the whole idea and the whole entity in a different way to find a solution that fits the regulations or the laws that exist. And I think that that's a different type of thinking. I think it's a thinking where don't place these artificial limits on yourself. You have to really broaden your horizon and think about everything you do know and kind of explore, brainstorm. And I think that's definitely a different type of thinking where you're brainstorming ideas. So I would call that more strategic and creative thinking. Yeah.
I see something else. Kind of follow up to the last question there about barriers. What are ways that you can sort of reduce those barriers? Then, like if you understand maybe English is a second language, or you're not used to the IRAC method and the PHILAC method and sort of the analytical reasoning in Canadian law schools, what are ways that you can improve so that you can be a better, whether it's a better candidate for the exams or in practice later on, or for my paralegal students throughout the rest of this program? What are some tips to better to see better results and that they can do from being trained foreignly to coming here?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If it comes to the question of English as a second language, you have to invest in yourself, and you should take some perhaps legal English writing courses. There are courses that are available. I don't personally teach those courses, but I would imagine that those courses would help you understand the structure and the methodology that we use in writing. And I know there are certain universities that offer these types of online programs for legal writing or English legal writing. And I'll give you, an example. I noticed that students that come from India, for example, have a very formal way of writing, and they write in legalese, which is not the Canadian way of writing. Our judges and courts and lawyers prefer very simple, plain language. And in other jurisdictions, they might use very formalistic, complex legalese. And so those cultural differences make a difference. And taking an English legal writing course may help you understand that, oh, wait a second, I have to dumb it down. That's all. These the Canadians don't understand me. I need to dumb down my language, for example. And that may be it. So you might come from a jurisdiction where they use that old formalistic language. And I'll tell you, when I was in court in the UK, while I was studying, I visited some courts. I was like, what the hell are they saying? I have no idea what that. Yeah, I speak English. I don't know what they're saying in court. The way they're arguing, it was so formal, and so I was so intimidated by that. And we don't necessarily speak like that here, even in court. Yes, there is a certain degree of formality and a certain way you treat the other parties and call them your friend and all that. And so we do have some formalities, but they're not like that. So taking a legal English course, I think, could help get over those barriers. But I'm no expert in learning the English language. But when it comes to analysis and reasoning, though, I think we mentioned it before. When you're studying for a particular course, you may not have to do this. You can do the minimum to get by. You can do the minimum you need to get your passing grade and then get your paralegal diploma and get licensed. But if you truly want to learn and you want to learn how to do this analysis, I think you should take the time to read decisions and read judgments. If you're going to be practicing law as a paralegal or as a lawyer, you're going to have to read vast amounts of information in very short amount of time. That's what legal research is about. And so why not pick up those skills now anyway, while you're doing your paralegal course? Because you're going to have to do it anyway. You're going to have to learn how to filter very quickly and read huge amounts of info. And even before I went to law school, the advice I got from one of my professors in business, he was actually a business law professor in my management course. He says you should read 3 newspapers every single morning. Like, 3 newspapers? Who has time to read 3 newspapers? He goes, no, you read 3 newspapers. You should get a conservative paper, a liberal paper, and somewhere in between a neutral paper, and you should read all 3 of them. And I'm like, well, how am I going to get through it? He goes, you'll learn. You'll learn to read, and within 15 minutes, I can read 3 newspapers because you're skimming articles, you're skimming papers. And why did he want me to read 3 papers? Because he just wanted me to broaden my horizons and get different perspectives and then start coming up with my own conclusions, right? You hear this side, you hear that side, and then you hear the middle, and then start thinking about it and start processing and analyzing bits of information. And that could be, you'll have to learn to get through vast amount of information quickly. And I think practice is the way to do it, and reading actual cases is the way to do it, and trying not to take a shortcut, because you do have to read this at the end of the day. So that's my tip, at least for learning the methodology and the analysis, is to actually go through and read it. And practice makes perfect. You will start out slowly. Of course, you will start out slowly. And there are tips and programs. Jim Quick, if you've heard of him, he's got some speed reading tips. I think his book is $1 right now on Amazon, the digital version. It's a book called Limitless, and he teaches you how to process information quickly. And I've just started that book myself. I haven't finished it, but that could be a great way to start. I think it's $1 right now on Amazon as a digital book, so you might want to look into it. It's called Limitless by Jim Quick. But you do need the skills to read quickly, and practice will get you there. Yeah.
Let's see if there's any other questions from any of the students. And if anyone wants to ask, you can put your hand up here and then and just unmute yourself, but otherwise you can post it in the chat. Do you have any other books or any other resources that you would recommend for students just starting a paralegal program that would help with the things that you've talked about?
There is perhaps, I mean, I did look up and I have an article on this very subject of critical thinking. It's a short article, and I think maybe I'll send it to you after so that you can send it out. But there are a couple of academic papers on critical thinking. And the article I'm specifically referencing talks about how this is not taught in law schools. So it's interesting, and it's just a very brief introduction to a book on critical thinking, but I will share the link with John Paul, and he can send it out to you. It's called Legal Education and Critical Thinking. So I thought it was an interesting read, and I just read it, before this class, but I'll be happy to share that as well. I think you may find that useful, and it is a book, but this is kind of an article introducing the book. Yeah, so happy to share that too.
Perfect. I don't see any other questions. I guess that maybe you can address. I see a couple that I'll talk to you about the paralegal versus legal assistant. I think I can explain that to the students there. But so thank you so much, Liran, for taking the time and joining us here today. If you have any final words of advice, or if anyone wants to connect with you, or if there are any students of mine, I know now with the University of London has a pretty popular program that I have a couple students who go on and want to go to law school through that online program. So maybe you can share a bit about what NCA Tutor is, and if they want to connect with you. But any final words about studying remotely and getting into the practice of law?
Yeah, I would just say that if you are considering a law degree, make sure you check the NCA policy, because the last thing you want to do is come back from law school and realize that it's not a qualifying law degree. And so an online law degree is going to create difficulties for you. You're going to have to go to law school for 2 years. And it's very challenging to get into law school as an advanced student because you're coming in the middle of the year. So be careful if you do an online degree, and I know all the degrees are being offered online right now, but the NCA has revised their policies as a result, and you need to do a particular amount of your course online interactive versus purely online, and some of it is going to have to be in class for it to be recognized here. And if it's not recognized here, you got to go back to law school. And so the last thing I want you to do is spend this time and money and then realize that you're going to have to go back to law school anyway in Canada. So just watch out for that. Make sure you are familiar with their policies before you invest that time and money, because it is expensive and you want to make sure it's useful. Parting words. Listen to your prof. You've got a great mentor. I've, throughout my degrees, and I've been to university 3 times now, I've always maintained, even in my undergrad, I still maintain my connections with my profs. I send them emails, I sent one of them a gift for their kid and whatever. And I have some very strong connections with those that moved me and changed me in some way, because I feel like I was really shaped by them, my career. So keep in touch. Your professor does care about you. He does, and he wants to see you succeed. And if there's a connection he can make, he'll be happy to make that connection for you, right? Maybe John Paul has a student who's already practicing in some law firm as a paralegal, and you're like, hey, I see this person is connected to you on LinkedIn. Do you think you can introduce me? I don't think he's going to be against it. So, keep in touch with your professors, because they can, well, at least in my case, I really love to hear from students, and I love to hear their progress. I love to hear where they are, and where they're practicing. And you never know, like I've sent students clients before, on multiple occasions. I've sent them clients because people have come to me, and I'm not practicing at the moment, so I send it to them. So do stay in touch. It's a great resource for you, a great mentor. And that's the best parting advice I can give. Yeah.
Perfect. And certainly even your classmates, as Liran talked about earlier, you never know where everyone's going to end up, and maybe they're already at the firm that you're looking to apply to. So keep those connections, and certainly come to people like Liran that have joined us here. It's a great way to network. It makes it a little easier for you because now you can say, hey, I'm in JP's class. I listened to her. I'm interested in so-and-so. Do you know anybody there? Rather than cold calling or cold email. I think that's the most daunting thing now, right? Because before you could go and say, hey, would you like a cup of coffee? And now could you spare 5 minutes on Zoom? I mean, it doesn't have the same effect, although I suppose it's a little easier. I found obviously getting people on this, it's a lot easier than trying to convince people to come downtown after a long day or commute, right? But it's still a little different. So take advantage of that and reach out to all of our guests that we've had. But certainly if you want to connect with Liran, I can provide you with the link there as well, and you can talk to him and have any further questions you may have of him. So thanks again for all the great advice, and I wish you all the best. And
Thank you so much. Thank
thanks
you
for
for
joining
having
us. And I guess if anyone, maybe if you want to hang out for a few minutes after I take this offline, if people have any specific questions about some other things.
Sure. Happy to stay. Thank you again. And thank you, Al, for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.